Hello there. So I had somebody in the comment section suggest that I use a lapel mic to record the videos because it was a little bit difficult to hear me. And unfortunately, I don't own a lapel mic, but I do own one of these mics, and so now I get to do these videos as if I'm a game show host. So honestly, I think it feels pretty cool to do it this way. All right, so welcome to another episode of Lewis Too Much Analyzes Comics. Today I'm going to be talking about the first Robin, Dick Grayson, who obviously later on goes on to become Nightwing. And I'm going to be talking about his personality via the MBTI lens. Now, I'm not personally a proponent of the MBTI. I think the MBTI is a little bit outdated. If you look at my video on personality typing superheroes 101, you'll see kind of like the background of the personality model that I prefer. But the MBTI, it still provides us kind of with these 4 letters up here, the ENFJ, the 16 personality archetypes, and so in that sense it is very helpful, and it's the most popular of the personality models that utilize the functions and all that kind of stuff. So that being said, I still utilize some elements of the MBTI, even though I think that the MBTI is a little bit outdated. All right, so that being said, let's go ahead and get right into Dick Grayson, otherwise known as Robin and Nightwing, and what personality he is. So Nightwing is an ENFJ. What does that mean? So an ENFJ is going to lead with extroverted feeling as their hero function. They're going to have introverted intuition as their secondary function. They are going to have extroverted sensing as their tertiary function. And they're going to have introverted thinking as their inferior function. Those are going to be their ego functions. And then their unconscious functions are going to be introverted feeling as the villain function, extroverted intuition as their critic function, introverted sensing as their trickster function, and extroverted thinking as their demon function. Okay, so what does this look like? Before I actually get into the personality itself, I want to go ahead and start off by saying that with Dick Grayson, I kind of like bandied about between a few personalities, and I finally settled on ENFJ, and I am actually pretty convinced that he's written fairly consistently as an ENFJ. The other 2 options that I thought about were ENFP and ESFP. The reason that I ended up settling on ENFJ is specifically because of this right here. To me, Dick Grayson actually has a fairly developed extroverted sensing function, and so when I get to that, I'll talk about why I think that is. Versus an ENFP, which would have extroverted sensing all the way at the bottom, and so it wouldn't be very natural for him to have that extroverted sensing highly developed, and so an ESFP would have extroverted sensing all the way at the top, but ESFPs are a little bit more peacocky actually than I think that Dick Grayson is, which may surprise some of you because you may think, well, Dick Grayson is a little bit peacocky, right? His first costume when he begins as a superhero is literally like wearing red and green and a yellow cape, right? Like he is begging for people to look at him. And so there is an element of peacockiness to Dick Grayson, but ultimately I don't think it's his defining feature. And so we're going to go ahead and get into that. Okay, so what does an ENFJ look like, and how does that look like for Dick Grayson? So Dick Grayson leads with extroverted feeling. What is extroverted feeling? Extroverted feeling is essentially a decision-making function in our minds that causes us to make decisions based on how those decisions affect other people's feelings. And so people who utilize extroverted feeling as a hero function, so if you remember my Batman video, I talked about how the hero function basically gives whatever function falls there a tinge of heroic quality to it, but not necessarily always in that selfless heroic quality. It actually kind of wants attention, and it's going to prioritize that thing as if it's the most important thing in the world. And so that's how ENFJs primarily approach the world. So they approach the world as if the most important thing in the world is other people's feelings. And because of that, they'll typically prioritize things like harmony. Harmony is very important to an ENFJ. Wanting to implement harmony as a system around them is going to be very important to an ENFJ. It's also going to cause an ENFJ to be very self-sacrificial. They are going to prioritize other people above themselves. They're going to want to go out of their way to sacrifice themselves for other people. It's actually going to give them a sense of purpose in life to sacrifice themselves for other people and to give of themselves for other people. Now, that's going to ultimately come into conflict with introverted feeling, which we'll talk about when we get into the unconscious functions. Now, the next of the functions for an ENFJ is introverted intuition. Now, introverted intuition does a few things. So, number one, it pattern detects. So, it's picking up patterns in the environment, and it's doing this unconsciously. You actually, introverted intuitors actually are not doing this intentionally. It just happens automatically. As they're walking through the world, their mind is picking up on all these patterns in the environment and trying to drill and trying to combine all those patterns, boil them down into one meta pattern that then projects for them a way forward or a path forward that they need to follow. And so introverted intuition is also very big on picking up on meaning, on the meaning behind things. And so extroverted sensing and introverted sensing are all about tangible reality. So intuition, the introverted intuition function is all about the meaning behind tangible reality. So the meaning behind the events that are being experienced in the real world. And so introverted intuitives typically are going to be trying to pick up on the meaning behind the language that you're speaking. They can sometimes kind of like zone out because they'll go into their introverted intuition and start like picking up on patterns in the words that you're saying or picking up on patterns in the environment that they're in. The other thing that introverted intuition does is it makes intuitives very driven because of the fact that introverted intuition is trying to boil everything down into this one pathway that they're supposed to follow, and that pathway is going to be the most meaningful of the pathways, and so it can make them very driven, very tunnel visioned. When they decide on a path, that's the path that they're going to pursue, and they're going to pursue it with intensity. Now, this is especially the case for ENFJs and ENTJs, who both have introverted intuition as their parent function. So the reason that it's called a parent function is that the parent, is that the function has elements very similar to that of a parent. And so that function is going to have a tinge of responsibility added to the function, on top of the fact that it's working very well. Not only is it working very well, it has this tinge of responsibility as if it's a very important as if that function needs to be utilized in order for this person to feel like they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. And so what that does to introverted intuition for ENFJs is it makes them very intense, because whatever pathway is generated for them, that is the pathway that they're going to pursue. All right, now how does this apply? Because for the most part, human beings live in these two functions right here, in the top two functions, right? So how does this look for Dick Grayson? Number one, how does it look for Dick Grayson as he is mentored by Batman, who, as we talked about in my first video, is an INTJ. So both of them actually share the intuitive function in their top two stacks. The difference is that for Dick Grayson, it's his second function. For Bruce, it's his first function. So one of the big distinctions there is that Bruce is an introvert, which means that he actually prefers being by himself, analyzing things by himself, doing his detective work by himself. Typically, he'll want to work by himself, versus Robin, or Dick Grayson, who is actually going to prefer to work in teams, which is why he actually makes a really good teammate to Bruce, because he will kind of almost insist that he get to tag along with Bruce, even though Bruce really sometimes will not want him there. And a lot of times Bruce is doing that right to protect Dick Grayson, and the way that our minds work is it's very complicated, right? Because our desires to protect and our desires to actually do the things that we want to do can sometimes get tangled up together, right? And so for Bruce, he might be thinking like, oh, I'm trying to protect him, but really what he wants is to be able to process things on his own without this very bubbly kid like jumping all over the place, right? Now that's going to be another feature of extroverted feeling being his top function, is it's going to make him actually want to engage with people, and extroverted people tend to be a lot more fast moving than introverts, and the reason for that is that they process things by engaging with the external world, versus introverts that process things internally, and so it actually takes introverts a little bit longer to process things, and they need to be alone in order to essentially function at the top of their game. Extroverts, to function at the top of their game, they're going to want to engage with the external world. And that's especially the case for extroverted feelers, for people who have extroverted feeling as their hero. This is why Dick Grayson makes an excellent leader later on for the Teen Titans, because extroverted feelers are all about the harmony of the team. That combined with their introverted intuition makes them really good about planning strategies, because they're picking up on patterns in the environment. ENFJs specifically pick up on patterns in human behavior because they pair their introverted intuition with their extroverted feeling. And so what they're doing is they're picking up on patterns in human emotions, which human emotions, right, are an expression of internal feelings. And those internal feelings are ultimately like a motivating factor in how humans behave. And so ENFJs are really good about picking up on patterns in human behavior. And so they make actually very excellent leaders because of the fact that, again, they're very driven, and they're very good at detecting, like, at reading the room in terms of how everybody's feeling, and they want to ultimately please all the people that they are leading, and so they'll actually take those people's desires into consideration anytime that they make a decision. So ENFJs make excellent leaders, which is actually one of the reasons why Dick Grayson a lot of times is talked about in the comics as being a better leader than Batman. Like, Batman ultimately tries to build teams, but because of the fact that, number one, he's so introverted, and number two, he's kind of disconnected from his feelings, he's not always picking up on kind of these subtleties of human behavior because he's thinking much more systematically than he is about other people's feelings. And so that's actually one of the big reasons why, again, Dick Grayson makes a better leader, and it's constantly talked about that he makes a better leader. And when I end up making a video about Superman, we'll see that actually Superman is also an extroverted feeler. He's not an ENFJ, at least I don't think he is. He's also an extroverted feeler, and that's actually why sometimes Superman and Dick Grayson get along much better than Dick Grayson and Bruce do. All right, now we can get to Dick Grayson's peacockness. Okay, so extroverted sensing is essentially your connection to your mind's connection to your tangible senses. So touch, taste, smell, all of that kind of stuff, right? And so extroverted sensing is also your connection to the external environment, to the external tangible environment, the physical environment. And so because it's a connection to that, typically high extroverted sensors, so people that'll have it in their top two functions, will tend to be very coordinated, very balanced. They'll pick up on tangible tasks really easily. They'll, a lot of them are going to be gymnasts, athletes, that kind of a thing, right? Now for Dick Grayson, he has it as his third function. So the third function is called the child function, and the reason for that is and you actually kind of like in popular psychology, terms, it's kind of like the inner child of the person, right? And so what extroverted sensing does in ENFJs is it gives the function an almost naive, pleasurable sensation, right? And so it'll enjoy indulging in that function, but it'll actually do it in like a very naive way. So we'll compare that one day when we do Catwoman, who is going to have extroverted sensing all the way at the top. For ENFJs, they're a little bit different. So they will peacock, but they'll peacock like in an almost naive, innocent, childish sort of way. And that's actually the way that Dick Grayson utilizes that extroverted sensing function. Like, he's not somebody that's like super into his appearance, and anytime that he's written that way, it's not really like true to his character. Because really, what he's all about is helping other people. That is something that Dick Grayson pours his heart and soul into. It, you know, he wants to help Bruce. He wants to help. He wants to be part of Bruce's mission so that he can help other people. Ultimately, Dick Grayson is somebody that's not really driven by the tragedy of his parents dying. That's something that Bruce is much more driven by, because he has introverted feeling child, and his introverted feeling child was wounded, permanently wounded, by the death of his parents, versus Dick Grayson, that he ultimately actually is a superhero because he wants to help people. It's not about him dealing with his own inner turmoil. It's really more about the fact that he's driven to help other people. All right. And so this extroverted sensing, number one, because he's an acrobat since the time that he's born, pretty much. His extroverted sensing function is super highly developed. And there's actually, so if you ever read the comic Robin Year One, which I highly recommend, I love that book, there's actually a scene where he's like cartwheeling all around the Batcave, and Batman actually points out that Dick Grayson is more skilled than he is in terms of like acrobatics and all of that kind of stuff. And this is when Dick Grayson is like 12 years old. And so the reason for that is actually because Batman has extroverted sensing here as his fourth function, and he actually had to develop that extroverted sensing function, and he develops it to like the peak of human perfection, and because he's such a driven person, like he's gonna push that function out to its limit. But for Dick Grayson, it's actually fun for him to utilize that function. For Bruce, it's much more fun for him to sit around doing detective work. That's actually what Bruce finds pleasurable, versus Dick Grayson, that he's actually going to find it much more pleasurable to basically be doing acrobatics and to do superhero work. That's why when you see Batman out on the field, right, it's almost like like a chore for him, right? Or it's a duty to him, right? Versus for Dick, he's actually enjoying it. He's out there like cartwheeling and flipping and like doing quips and all that kind of stuff. Which, by the way, that's another function of his being extroverted, like the quippiness and all that. That he's like gonna hit the bad guys with quips. He's gonna be playful as he's out there in the field. All of that is tied into his top three functions. All right. Now his fourth function is introverted thinking. Now this is really interesting because the fact that he gets raised by Batman really helps him out with this right here. So ENFJs, their fourth function, their inferior function, is introverted thinking. Now, what is introverted thinking? Introverted thinking is a logic function, and it's basically, and so what is logic? It's pretty much you start with a premise and you work from that premise all the way out to its conclusion, and you basically go step by step by step all the way until you get to that ultimate conclusion. For ENFJs, honestly, in America, this isn't so much of a problem for them because ultimately all of us go to school until we're 18 or 22 if we end up going to college or whatever, sometimes way beyond that, like for me. And so our anybody that has thinking towards the bottom of their function stack will typically have that function develop, regardless, just because of the fact that it gets trained during schooling. But for ENFJs, typically what that means is that they don't really make decisions so much based on logic as much as they do based on other people's feelings. And so they're actually going to prioritize other people's feelings above whatever is logical. Now, ENFJs can definitely develop this function. I know a few ENFJs that are incredibly intelligent because of the fact that they've spent time developing this function. But ultimately, their preference is always really going to be to make decisions based on how they can best help other people. And a lot of times what they'll do is they'll actually utilize their logic function to assist them in helping other people. Whenever I do an ISTP, which I believe Huntress is an ISTP off the top of my head, I'll talk about how introverted thinking when it's towards the top is very different than for an ENFJ who has it here down towards the bottom. Now, like I said, because of the fact that Dick Grayson was raised by Bruce Wayne, and Bruce, number one, is a high T user. Uh, he had it like drilled into him that he needs to basically like uh, develop this function. He has to become a detective. He has to exercise that function, that logic function, and not always prioritize other people's feelings above that logic function, because sometimes in order to help other people, right, you need to use that logic to solve cases, right? Now, the cool thing about the inferior function is that when somebody has a function as an inferior function, if they start working on it, especially if they start working on it from the time that they're young, they can actually develop it into a function that works better than their hero function. Now, the reason for that is that the hero function is effortless and it really takes no discipline to develop it. It's just the thing that you do automatically. Versus your inferior function, the inferior function, because you have to pour so much energy and effort into developing it, it's when you utilize it, it's a very honed function, and so that's essentially what happens with Dick Grayson, right? Like he becomes an excellent detective by the time that he's Nightwing. To prepare for this video, I read through a little bit of Chuck Dixon's run on Nightwing, and one of the things that is kind of highlighted over and over and over is that Dick Grayson is an excellent detective, and that he's not Batman. Obviously, he's the world's greatest detective, but he is an excellent detective, and ultimately he never will be as good a detective as Batman, because Batman is a high thinker and he's a very efficient thinker, versus introverted thinking, which is much more process oriented. Now, I'm an introverted thinker, so personally I enjoy the fact that it's much more process oriented because it doesn't cut corners as much. It doesn't have as many blind spots. It can have blind spots, but ultimately typically not as many as extroverted thinkers. Which, if you want to see the last video that I did on Batman, I talk about what extroverted thinking looks like. Okay. All right. So basically, these four functions right here are going to be the basis for Nightwing's ego. Again, the ego is the conscious part of the mind. It's the part of the mind that you actually have control over, versus this, which is your unconscious mind. And it essentially like sneaks up from behind you and sometimes will take control of you. A good example of this is when you're hungry, right? So let's say that you're hungry. You haven't eaten for a day or so. Let's say that you went without food for whatever the reason, right? And your body starts getting angry at you, right? And it starts sending all these chemicals up into your brain, and it starts actually impacting your mood, and that mood actually starts impacting your personality and the way that you react to other people, right? These are unconscious processes that you ultimately didn't summon that mood. That mood came up from inside of you and is essentially impacting your personality, and that's really your body trying to tell you, hey, we need to eat. So that's why I'm making you cranky, okay? And so in the same way, these functions operate very similarly to that, right? So we're living up here, but these functions are getting ignored by our conscious mind. And so because of that, they start screaming up from the background and trying to claw up and pull at the other functions. And if you notice, the unconscious functions are essentially the opposite function of each of your conscious functions, right? And so here's how that's going to work for Dick Grayson. So because Dick Grayson leads with extroverted feeling, he's going to prioritize other people's feelings. He's actually going to have kind of a desire to sacrifice himself for others. And so because he's constantly sacrificing himself for others, and he's constantly putting up with other people's faults and dealing with other people's faults, what will happen is eventually introverted feeling is your connection, your mind's connection to your personal emotions. Because of that, his introverted feeling will periodically rise up, and what will happen is he'll get this rush of almost like self-righteousness. That's a lot of times what will happen to ENFJs. This will happen for two reasons. Number one, when they've been sacrificing for too many people for too long, and their own personal feelings rise up and tell them, hey, you matter too, you need to protect us. So those are the emotions talking, right? You need to protect us You can't just worry about everybody else's feelings. You have feelings too. Your feelings matter, and so they'll rise up. And basically, like, almost ENFJs might get swallowed up for a moment there, actually, by a bout of selfishness, where like they'll really be concerned about their own emotions over other people's emotions, because of the fact that their introverted feeling kind of like swallows them up. Now, the other possibility is their extroverted feeling hero is out there like helping people, and then all of a sudden they see somebody abusing somebody else, and then what'll happen is extroverted feeling is going to almost communicate with introverted feeling, and it's going to rise up as a surge of self-righteousness, where it's like, we need to stop this right now. And so introverted feeling will kick in and make them very like justice oriented in that moment. And so Dick Grayson, actually, like a perfect example of this is, if you've ever watched Batman the Animated Series. If you have not, and you have HBO Max, right after this video, make sure that you go to HBO Max. Number one, watch Robin's Reckoning, the 2-part episode, Robin's Reckoning, and then watch the episode Old Wounds. Both of those episodes are a perfect summary of Dick Grayson. And so in the episode Old Wounds, it explains why eventually Robin actually breaks his relationship with Batman. And it tells the story where there's this scene that the Joker has escaped, and Batman is trying to track him down, and he ends up figuring out that there's this one guy that's one of Joker's henchmen, and so that him and Dick Grayson follow the henchman to the henchman's house, and Batman ends up attacking the henchman as soon as he gets into the house, and he's like pinning him up against the wall, and right behind him is the henchman's family, his wife and a little boy. And so Dick Grayson, or Robin, he comes into the room and he sees the little boy like terrified of the fact that Batman is holding his father up against the wall and is like threatening his life. And Robin basically tells him like, hey, Batman, calm down, like, don't do this in front of the kid. And Batman is so tunnel visioned in that moment, because he needs to capture the Joker, right? Because ultimately for him, it's all about that system of order. Again, go back to my Batman video. It's all about that system of order for him. So in that moment, he's not really concerned about people's feelings around him. And in fact, he's not even really aware of the feelings of the people around him. He's so focused in on pinning that criminal up against the wall and finding out where the Joker is, that Robin actually gets angry at him and tells him, man, this is bogus, I'm out of here. And he actually like jumps out the window and swings away. And later on in the episode, he ultimately ends up quitting being Robin, because he can't put up with the fact that Batman has become so cold, and so like driven by his mission, that he's actually like forgetting about the little people along the way, right? Which is really what extroverted feeling is all about. And so again, that introverted feeling kicks in and hits him with that fist of self-righteousness, that it's like, I've been putting up with this guy's mistakes for too long, for my whole life. I've been putting up with this guy just being cold and not providing me with any like good feelings. Like, everything for him, and as far as like trying to treat me like a son, is all about like him teaching me to be like more system oriented and all that, very structured, and not ultimately caring about whether or not he's making me like feel good, or like helping me deal with my emotions, right? And so ultimately he ends up quitting at the end of that episode. And so that's kind of like an example of how Dick Grayson's introverted feeling is going to like suddenly rush up on him periodically. So it can basically be tied to one of those two circumstances. The other thing that introverted feeling, so the function, the first of the unconscious functions is called your villain function. And so the reason for that is that it basically antagonizes the hero function. And so the villain function typically is going to be your source of worry. And so what will happen to ENFJs and what will happen to Dick Grayson is, a lot of times they'll actually worry whether or not their emotions, number one, whether or not what exactly they are experiencing in terms of emotions, because they're so used to feeling things via other people that they'll actually neglect their own emotions, and so their own emotions will sometimes be a little bit of a mystery to them. But more so than that is they'll worry whether or not their feelings are actually valid, whether or not they deserve to feel what they're feeling. And so they'll typically actually try and outsource their feelings. They'll ask other people like, "Hey, what is it that I'm feeling right now?" And so that'll come across actually sometimes in like in the Teen Titans, where like Dick Grayson will like question himself, and actually that happens too in the Grant Morrison run when Dick Grayson takes over being Batman. I love that run, by the way. Like, if if anybody can get their hands on that, it's printed all over the place. So if you can get your hands on that, read that. In that run, what happens is Dick Grayson takes over being Batman, and Batman's son, who is Damian Wayne, takes over being Robin. And Damian Wayne is this like psychopathic assassin kid that Dick Grayson essentially takes under his wing to train him to be a good person. And I'll do a video on Damian Wayne a little bit later on. But in that run, Dick spends the whole first part of the run very worried about the fact that he's not going to live up to the mantle of being Batman. And actually, that's a lot of times how ENFJs experience their introverted feeling hero. It's through this self-doubt of whether or not their emotions are valid, whether or not they're capable. And so, because introverted feeling also tends to have your self-worth tends to be tied into that introverted feeling. And so for ENFJs, they can sometimes worry about whether or not they're worthy of whatever task they're trying to accomplish. All right? Okay, so I spent a lot of time on that one. Let's move on to the extroverted intuition critic. So the extroverted intuition critic is very interesting for ENFJs. So the way that works is, number one, so when you have an extroverted critic, typically what will happen is it's going to do two things. So if you have an extroverted critic, it's going to criticize the world around you, and it's also going to criticize you via that function. Okay? And so for the extroverted intuition for ENFJs, essentially what will happen is, so extroverted intuition is the opposite of introverted intuition, obviously. So introverted intuition is trying to boil everything down into one pathway. Extroverted intuition is trying to break everything apart into a variety of pathways and generate multiple pathways. And so what happens to extroverted intuition when it's paired with the critic with the critic disposition is that it'll basically critique the pathway that others are on. And so this is why ENFJs can get very tunnel visioned and single-minded, because their critic is basically critiquing all other pathways, but their own pathway, it's like, okay, this is the one pathway, and we're going to move forward down this pathway. And so you can actually, again, see that in that episode where Dick Grayson blows up on Batman, because in his mind, it's like, this guy, he doesn't know he doesn't know how to, like how to interact with other people. There's no other way to interact with other people except my way of interacting with other people, which is by caring about everybody's feelings all the time. And what's really ironic is that at the end of that episode, Dick Grayson ends up bumping into that same guy that Batman was holding up against the wall. Later on, like years later, he ends up bumping into that guy, and the guy now has a job at Wayne Enterprises, because Bruce Wayne, after Batman basically held him up against the wall, Bruce Wayne comes around and basically like follows the guy's criminal proceedings and everything like that. And ultimately, when the guy gets out of jail, Bruce Wayne gives him a job at Wayne Enterprises so that he can now live an honest life. And the guy actually says that Bruce Wayne is the one that essentially led him onto a righteous path, right? And so what'll happen to ENFJs, right, is when they start getting confronted with alternative paths, their instinct is to criticize those other paths. But what a healthy ENFJ will do is start to recognize, as they get more and more mature, that there are alternative ways of living outside of the one pathway that their introverted intuition is telling them to live on. And so The extroverted intuition critic, that's something ultimately that ENFJs have to work on. As I said in my last video, the critic function tends to be the source of human hypocrisy, so your own personal hypocrisy, because ultimately the critic is holding you to a hyper high standard. And so then what will happen is then you'll want to hold other people to a hyper high standard. And so what ENFJs will do is they will assume that everybody else's pathway is dangerous, or it's not taking everybody's feelings into consideration, or it's not picking up on the patterns well enough, or whatever the case may be, right? So they'll get convinced that their way of pursuing a goal is the way to pursue a goal, and then they'll critique everybody else's way of pursuing a goal. And then what will happen to them is that actually anytime that they start deviating from their goal, their mind will actually tell them like these other pathways are dangerous, because it'll critique the other pathways, which typically also the critic function kind of I would say, especially for the high feeling types, that's at least my experience, makes us kind of neurotic because of the fact that it's basically like making us like second guess ourselves and like worry about this kind of thing. So that's basically how the critic function works for ENFJs. Next is going to be the trickster function. Now this is one of those places where actually Bruce and Dick are very similar to each other. So if you saw my Batman video, you would have noticed that Batman has introverted sensing down here. Dick Grayson has it right here. Okay, these two are going to be not exactly the same, but fairly similar in terms of how they manifest themselves as human behaviors. And so what introverted sensing does is when I get to a character that has introverted sensing really high, or if you want to go to my personality typing 101 video, I'll explain introverted sensing in a little more depth, but since it's one of the lower functions here, really I'll just talk about its manifestation. And so the way that it really manifests itself is introverted sensing, one of its duties or functions is to essentially like take care of you. It's to like get into a habitual routine, because ultimately habitual routines are actually good for you, right? Because they give your body like again, it's a routine, and so your body can get used to that routine, and it can stay healthy, it can get accustomed to whatever routine you're on. What will happen for people that have very low introverted sensing, and so in the case of ENFJs and Dick Grayson, is it's going to fall into his trickster function. So the trickster function it's almost like a child function, but it's playing games on you. So it's like a naughty child. It's like a bad kid, like messing around with you. And so whatever function falls there, it's almost like it gets static. That function gets static. So it's still there, but you experience it through this like haze or fog. So it's like it's playing a trick on you. And so what will happen is for ENFJs is that because this function is really all about routine and taking care of yourself, is people that have very low introverted sensing, just like Batman, will not take care of themselves. They'll basically binge on their mission. Typically, that's what's going to happen to Dick Grayson or Bruce Wayne. Is they're so driven by their in their introverted intuition function that they'll forget to take care of themselves, and so they'll go days without taking care of themselves. And then it'll all catch up to them, right? And so this is one of those things where there's this issue in Nightwing where Tim Drake and Dick Grayson are they're kind of like patrolling the city that Nightwing is in at that time. It's called Bloodhaven, and they're patrolling the city. And Tim Drake points out to Dick Grayson that Bruce and Dick Grayson they're not 100% alike. They have some very stark differences, but in some ways they're very, very much alike. And really, like, what you can tie that down to is that introverted intuition that like tunnel visions them, and this introverted sensing all the way towards the bottom that basically makes them not take care of themselves because they're so busy pouring themselves into, in Dick Grayson's case, it's protecting everybody, taking care of everybody, and for Bruce, it's basically like uh, fulfilling that mission to essentially abolish all crime in Gotham. It's like the most impossible mission ever, right? Um, and so that's essentially how it's going to manifest for ENFJs and specifically for Dick Grayson. All right, and then we're going to get to this last function, which this is actually going to be a huge source of conflict between Batman and Dick Grayson. And that is extroverted thinking. So extroverted thinking is all about systems of order. This is why Bruce Wayne, in his head, thinks that he's going to eradicate all crime in Gotham, because he's going to establish this gigantic network of order that permeates his entire city. And as long as he just pours himself completely into his mission, he is going to essentially eradicate, and you know, obviously he's constantly confronted with the reality that that's not actually realistic, but that, you know, in his mind, that's actually what he would, in his dream world, that's what he would do. And I talked in my Batman video, if you've ever read the story Kingdom Come, essentially what Bruce does is he implements this gigantic system of order where there's all these like bat robots that patrol the city, and they essentially eradicate all crime, right? And so what happens with ENFJs is they, so the reason that this is a demon function is because it's essentially all the source of your rage. And so whenever you experience this function, you experience it through a lens of this sucks. Like, I do not like this. It's like through a prism of anger. And so what will happen to ENFJs is large-scale systems of order they will find stifling. And when they see people trying to help other people via extroverted thinking, again through those systems of order, which is the complete opposite essentially of extroverted feeling. Extroverted feeling is all about generating harmony, like inner harmony from people, so everybody wants to cooperate. Like, that's ultimately what extroverted feeling fantasizes about. Extroverted thinking is all about making everybody get in line together, right? And so everybody cooperates, but it's by all wearing the same uniform, by all obeying the same processes, all obeying the same procedures. And so ENFJs, what will happen is when they see other people utilizing that function, they will think those people are bad people. And so this is why ultimately Dick Grayson and Bruce Wayne fight a lot as Dick Grayson gets older, because ultimately what happens is Batman is essentially trying to rescue the world via his extroverted thinking, versus Dick Grayson, who views his extroverted thinking as this impositional force, and that's why they constantly have conflict later on in life, and they constantly need the other Robins to like kind of heal the rift between them. Okay. The one last thing in terms of the demon function is that when you are bottomed out, so like if you're in a situation where you've completely bottomed out, your life for whatever reason is completely wrecked, your mind will essentially cycle through each of the functions and arrive at your final function trying to see, is this last function going to save us? And so what can happen with ENFJs is two things. Is number one, they may break systems of order if that system of order is the thing that's causing their problem. And so in the case of Dick Grayson, that's actually what he does with Batman, is he breaks his system of order, like he breaks the system of order. And so you don't want to think about system of order always in terms of like a political system or like a government or something like that. It can be a local system of order. So something as small as a family can be a system of order. And so Dick Grayson will break that system of order when he goes all the way down into rage mode, which is literally what he does in that episode, Old Wounds, right? He punches Batman in the face, and in his mind, it's like, this thing is over. I am not coming back. And so that, you know, that's what an ENFJ will do when they fall down all the way to the bottom of their function stack. The other thing that they may do, actually, is impose a very negative system of order where it's like, you guys are not going to get along with each other? Well, then this is what we're going to do. We're all going to get along with each other, and I'm going to make sure we all get along with each other. And so it's going to be like a system of order, but from a very negative place. And actually, there's this comic called, I think it's Nightwing New Order, something like that. I don't remember the exact name. It's written by Kyle Higgins. But that's essentially what happens, where Nightwing imposes this, like, very negative system of order. It's like he almost absorbs Bruce's negative trait. Well, it's a negative trait from Dick Grayson's perspective. He almost absorbs that and then turns it into like a system of order. All right. All right. So that's Dick Grayson. I hope that you all enjoyed the video. And next time I'm going to do Jason Todd. I hope to see you there. And thank you so much for listening. Anybody that watches this, from the bottom of my heart, I love you very much.